I get a lot of deep philosophical questions here, and the two questions I'm asked more than any other are, number one, is Mike Patton God? And two, is Robert Pattinson's mustache the most masculine thing you've ever seen? So this week, I'll answer both of those questions. We'll examine the album The Director's Cut by Mike Patton's Fantomas and the 2019 film The Lighthouse by Robert Eggers. Understanding is useful, so here we go. I'm Carl King, and this is the Carl King Podcast, where every week we learn about music, filmmaking, and creativity. If you like this show, head over to patreon.com/Carl King and join for just $1 or $5 per month. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. Special thank you to my Illusionist $51 level patrons, both Hank Howard III and Chew Bode. Quick shout out to my music endorsements: Vienna Symphonic Library, Fractal Audio, Ernie Ballstrings, Toontrack, and Millennium Media. Now, let's get this episode begin. Just a few Carl King the Human updates, and then we will officially get beginned. Number one, it's continuing to warm up out here in Southern California. So this weekend, I washed my car with a pressure washer. And good news, I was only bleeding in one place this time. Number two, this past Friday, I worked on more music for the Chris Higgins Tetris documentary series called Best of Five. Specifically, the first scene of the first episode. And since you're still here, I'll play you a clip from it right now. Best of Five should be released this year. So to find out more, head over to bestoffivemovie.com. Number three, I'll be making some new short videos for Vienna Symphonic Library in the coming weeks. In the meantime, you can see my previous two videos, and in one video, I demonstrate Stravinsky's Petrushka chord, which has gotten nearly 80,000 views. And the other video, how to pair harp and vibraphone in stereo to get that 60s Star Trek music sound. And both are available on youtube.com/Carl Kingdom. And now, let's get into this week's analytical music theory analysis of the week. In this week's analytical music theory analysis of the week, we will explore the creative arranging and mixing choices that Mike Patton made on the Fantomas record, The Director's Cut. That's where he took famous horror film scores and reinterpreted them in his own avant-garde 1980s hair metal style. And even though it's over 2 decades old at this point, it happens to be my favorite record Mike Patton has done on his own. We'll examine his works on 3 different tracks: Spider Baby, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, and The Omen. Example number 1 is Spider Baby, based on music from the film Spider Baby, or The Maddest Story Ever Told, from 1967. And it was composed by Ronald Stein. This is an interpretation of the opening credits song, which had vocals performed by Lon Chaney Jr., who also starred in the film and performed vocals on it. Now, I want to point out that the original Spider Baby song has 2 renditions. The version in the film is muddy and seems to possibly be in mono and only lasts for just over 2 minutes. But there is a much clearer stereo version, which runs nearly 5 minutes. And I will put a link to both of those versions in the show notes so you can click on the hyperlinks and make them open up. Now, here are 8 things that Mike Patton did differently with Spider Baby. Number 1, the hard panning. In the opening, there is a piano riff, hard left, and percussion, hard right. The original was, I think, saxophone on the left and piano on the right. And there's some other hard panning happening here, including a left and right guitar, but also notice that those guitars don't have perfectly identical tones. And that is an effective way to create some dimensionality. Number 2, there are heavily compressed and overdriven drums. Dave Lombardo was credited on this album, but I would not be surprised if this track used a loop rather than Lombardo himself. Number 3, in the chorus, which is not exactly a chorus, there is a dissonant melody played by the brass, and Patton instead sings that melody with his mouth and teeth. And number 4, the chorus, at around 42 seconds, there's a portamento synth panned hard right, and he added hand claps on quarter notes. And the original had a similar sound to human hand claps, but it sounds more like a bunch of musicians banging their bows on the music stands and stomping their feet. And again, those hand claps on the Fantomas version sound like they're hard panned left and right, but the tone between those channels doesn't entirely match. Number 5, at 56 seconds, to break things up, he added what sounds like what would normally be a 4-beat pause, but instead a 5-beat pause filled with some Mr. Bungle-esque sound design. And it's even got the Simpsons' grandpa, huh! Number 6, the original song only has 2 parts, an A and a B section. But on the Fantomas version, at 1 minute 28 seconds, there's a verse that drops down and acts as a bridge. And it sounds like it's got 2 drum sets or 2 drum loops, hard panned in stereo, and an out-of-phase effect happening. Listening to it through headphones that you would place on your ears, the effect is nauseating and will also make you want to throw up. And that slowly ramps back to a normal, in-phase sound through automation as they approach the chorus. So he created a bridge from what would have been just another verse. And that's some good thinking, Mike Patton. And number 7, the final time around the chorus, in the second half of it, the part that comes after the first half, the kit that is made out of individual drums changes quite a bit. And number 8, he decided to end this track with an ending rather than a fade out, which you would hear in the film's opening credits. And my main takeaway is this: don't be afraid to use some hard panning. And don't be afraid to make people nauseated. And if you double an instrument in stereo, you can make each one slightly different in tone, rather than a perfect copy. Example number 2 is the theme from Twin Peaks, Fire Walk with Me, composed by Angelo Badalamenti in 1992. You might be familiar with the opening credits music from the Twin Peaks TV show, and this piece has some similar motifs, but it is not the same piece of music. And that's right, and the opposite of wrong. Fire Walk with Me had its own theme. And why they did that? We don't know yet, or maybe we do. Maybe it was a legal issue. But these things happen because music is a serious crime. Angelo Badalamenti's instrumentation was an intimate jazz ensemble, which is a muted trumpet, upright bass, keyboards, and a drummer using brushes. It's the sort of thing you'd hear using your ears in a quiet little jazz bar. So let's look at 6 things Mike Patton did differently with his interpretation of Twin Peaks' Fire Walk with Me. Number 1, in the intro, we have a bit of a heavier instrumentation with distorted hair metal guitars, although they are at a much lower dynamic level. And there's also echoing, robotic-sounding computerized synthesizer flourishes. Number 2, when the main melody begins, Mike Patton replaces that muted trumpet made of brass and instead sings it with some syllables that sound like what-a do to do, which is obviously more that classic Mike Patton toilet humor that we all love. And also some finger snaps with a very fast echo effect on beat 4. Number 3, after 4 measures, we get blasts of hair metal instrumentation. And listening through headphones, I could be wrong, but I suspect that snare drum roll was overdubbed on top of the loud kick, drum, and cymbal crashes. And I think that's because the snare drum roll seems to be unbroken. And unless Dave Lombardo has 3 arms, which he might, I would expect larger gaps in that roll in order for his arm to reach the cymbals, which are mounted on cymbal stands. Number 4, the second time around in that very hair metal phrase at 1 minute 15 seconds, Mike Patton layers in some intense, high-pitched screams with lots of distortion, which I can't quite hear in the original. Number 5, after that, there's a section with a drum loop for 7 bars, followed by 1 bar with a chromatic descending synthesizer. And number 6, about halfway through this rendition, at 1 minute 51 seconds, Mike Patton adds what appears to be his own written lyrics. And if anyone knows the story behind that, let me know. It sounds like Dave Lombardo might be playing along with a drum loop during this very long section. The main takeaway, I think, is if you interpret an instrumental film score theme, just go ahead and add your own lyrics about box springs and spare change. Example number 3 is The Omen, Ave Satani, originally composed by Jerry Goldsmith, released in 1976. And the original had evil choir chanting coming out of a bunch of mouths. And there is a minor ninth from our good friend Music Theory. We hear strings and a chromatic riff and church organ. And that makes for a slow and ominous audio sound. Now, let's look at 5 things that Mike Patton did differently with his version of Jerry Goldsmith's The Omen. Number 1, in the intro, it sounds similar to the original. There's a small choir of Mike Pattons singing in Latin, along with high strings and a church organ. And it sounds like it could be a legitimate film score for a movie projected inside a movie theater where people would go to be watching it. And number 2, heavy guitars played through amplifiers come in, along with frantic scrambly percussion that sounds like 100 pencils clattering away on hard surfaces. And there's also a harshly EQ'd vocal in monophonic or dual monophonic. Number 3, after the drum fill, Dave Lombardo launches into a cutting the steak punk beat with a heavily compressed and overdriven tone, and the vocals split into hard-panned left and right for contrast against the previous section. Number 4, at 1 minute and 3 seconds, the drum kit stops and is replaced by percussion that sounds like that frantic pencils clattering on a table and music stand, although now they are locked in time with the music. And Dave Lombardo adds some cymbal rolls, which is a rock and roll technique where he rolls the cymbals around. And number 5, at the end, it returns to what could pass as a legitimate film score with the choir of Mike Patton vocals and haunted church organ from a church that could be haunted. Now, I really only knew the Omen music from this Fantomas record, and I somehow never got around to seeing the original film or checking out the score. So I finally did, and I realized that there are some counterpoint melody details missing from this rendition, which were pretty significant in Jerry Goldsmith's version. Most importantly, Mike Patton left out that minor ninth that existed in the intro in Jerry Goldsmith's version. So, in my own totally subjective opinion, this track is the only one out of the 3 that didn't quite live up to the richness of the original. There's a lot left out, so it's more like, let's take this film score and make it into hair metal. But the Fantomas rendition definitely has its own fun energy to it, perfect for cutting up cardboard boxes in the garage when those cardboard boxes pile up for too long in your garage. And I am contractually obligated to point out that horror film scores are perfect for metal renditions because those two genres start with the same building blocks: chromaticism, dissonance, and most importantly, riffs. So if you haven't already, I recommend checking out Fantomas, the director's cut, from your local public library, which is where you can get it from. Now, to answer the most important question of all time, is Mike Patton God? I can't remember. And now, let's move on to this week's analytical filmmaking analysis of the week. This week's analytical filmmaking analysis of the week is The Lighthouse from 2019, screenwritered and directed by Robert Eggers, and starring Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe. Now, this is a Type 2 film, as we learned in the previous episode, and as a refresher, the 7 dimensions of a Type 2 film, according to Carl King, are number 1, surprise; 2, abstraction; 3, ambiguity; 4, subtlety; 5, nonlinearity; 6, ironic counterpoint; and 7, conspicuous slowness. So let's look at number 1, surprise. The first thing we notice visually is the aspect ratio. It's almost a square, meaning the visual image area is almost as tall as it is wide. These days, we're used to seeing films and movies that are much wider than they are tall. But Robert Eggers wanted to convey the old-timey look of films from, the 1920s or 1930s. Now, that aspect ratio helps to express a sense of confinement the two men are experiencing trapped in that tiny building together. And it required the actors to physically be pushed closer together in the shots, increasing the tension. Second surprise, This film is entirely black and white, processed with a harsh, intense contrast. And it brings out all of those ugly details in the sweaty skin pores and facial hair. And there are other aspects of surprise, but I'll mention just one more. It's rare to have a film with only two characters in a single location. And that is a strong indication of a Type 2 film. Number 2, abstraction. Let's start with the symbolism of the lighthouse itself, which was blatantly intended to represent a male genitalia. According to the internet, Robert Eggers originally included close-up shots of real erections juxtaposed with shots of the lighthouse, but he was forced to remove them. And that all pairs nicely with the theme of repressed homosexuality and sexuality in general throughout this film. At one point, the two men are drunk and trapped in a tiny room together for so long that they have an awkward moment and almost kiss. But then disgust takes over and they turn to violence. But there are also scenes where they slow dance and even cuddle. And there are also indications that Robert Pattinson's character is fundamentally uncomfortable with his own sexual desires. For example, when he's having an erotic hallucination about the mermaid, he is also disgusted by the mermaid, as well as fantasizing that Willem Dafoe is the mermaid. So I think the moment of Robert Pattinson finally reaching the light in the top of the lighthouse is him realizing that he is into naked men. And on a more surface level, there's also Robert Pattinson's denial that his real name is Thomas. It's the same first name as Willem Dafoe's character, so there's a lot of denial going on all around. The power dynamics between the two men is another abstract theme, because throughout the film, it is a struggle for dominance. Willem Dafoe makes Robert Pattinson do menial and physically degrading jobs around the lighthouse, while he goes up and gets naked every night with the lens at the top of the tower. He's also got gross macho mannerisms like clearing his throat all the time and mouth breathing and farting in close proximity to Robert Pattinson without any concern, because making bodily sounds is a sign of dominance. There are also direct references to Greek mythology. For instance, Robert Pattinson's character is related to Prometheus, and Willem Dafoe's character is related to Proteus. And the mermaid represents the sirens, which were dangerous creatures that lured sailors to their deaths. And that foghorn also relates to the siren's song. And somehow the seagulls represent dead sailors. And in a heavily surreal moment at about 1 hour, 17 minutes, 40 seconds, there is a shot where a totally naked Willem Dafoe blasts light rays out of his eyes at Robert Pattinson. And that is actually a direct reference to a 1904 painting called Hypnosis by German artist Sascha Schneider. Number 3, ambiguity. This film contains supernatural elements, and if you're not careful, you might be unsure what type of movie you're actually watching here. Because at times, it might seem like you're watching a fantasy story. For instance, is the mermaid real? Are the seagulls actually dead sailors? Is Willem Dafoe able to actually transform into a tentacled sea monster? Does the lens at the top of the lighthouse have some sort of magical powers? Or are these simply hallucinations? What is really going on? We don't know. But Robert Eggers insists on leaving the film open to interpretation. And he's definitely a master of ambiguity. Number 4, let's look at the dimension of subtlety, particularly in the realm of acting. In Type 2 films, the characters don't often just come out and say exactly what they're thinking. The actors are required to convey their thoughts through micro-expressions and long pauses. So through much of this film, we're just watching them thinking and slowly losing their minds. But we also get scenes of the actors going big with explosions of anger and screaming, accompanied by over-the-top dissonant score, setting up the long dramatic arc with increasing stored-up tension is an investment in those future moments. And those subtle scenes make the more outrageous scenes more acceptable to us. Number 5, nonlinearity. And I use the term nonlinearity both in terms of the story's structure as well as the leaps of understanding that the audience is expected to fill in on their own. So even though the story's events do flow in a traditional sequence from past to present, they are interrupted by dream sequences, hallucinations, and flashbacks. And regarding leaps of understanding, there is a subtle use of unreliable narrators. And that's when the abstract person who is telling us the story, that sort of invisible God behind the camera lens, might actually be lying. As the story progresses, we see signs that Willem Dafoe might be gaslighting Robert Pattinson. At one point, he tells him, they've actually been stranded there for weeks and running out of food. So is the story's perspective shifting between characters so that we are seeing multiple versions of reality? It makes us wonder, can we trust what we're being shown? Instead of treating us as passive viewers, Robert Eggers is engaging us and turning us all into detectives. And number 6, ironic counterpoint, there's a scene towards the end of the film where Robert Pattinson finally beats the crap out of Willem Dafoe and achieves dominance. And he makes him bark like a dog, leads him outside to a hole, throws him in, and slowly buries him alive. So there's a long, continuous shot pushing in of Willem Dafoe getting dirt shoveled onto his face as he recites a poetic monologue. So for over a full minute, he's getting dirt in his eyes and nose and mouth, and he's even chewing on it as he says, "Oh, what protean forms swim up from men's minds and melt in hot Promethean plunder, scorching eyes with divine shames and horror and casting them down to Davy Jones. The others still blinded, yet in it see all the divine graces, and to fiddler's green scent, where no man is suffered to want or toil, but is ancient, mutable, and unchanging as the she who girdles round the globe. Them's truth, and you'll be punished." And he willingly lets this all happen and suddenly dies before he's even completely buried. And that is definitely some ironic counterpoint, because if I were being buried alive, I doubt I would lie there and recite poetry. Then again, I don't know any poetry. And number 7, conspicuous slowness. I don't think a film could be more conspicuously slow than The Lighthouse. The first 7 minutes of the film are the 2 men arriving to a remote island by ship, and it seems they are relieving the previous 2 lighthouse men who were stationed there. And there is a 20-second shot of them seeming to stand there staring directly into the camera. And it made me think of Wes Anderson, almost as if the characters are posing for a portrait. But the following shot shows the ship heading back out to sea and disappearing into the fog. So in film language, we would think that's what they were actually staring at instead of the camera. Although the staring was so striking and bizarre, the two shots didn't seem to really belong together. Now, as I've said before, 7 minutes in film years is a long time. So during that initial 7 minutes of the film, nothing amazing or even very interesting happens. There's no action-filled teaser here. It's just the two men carrying their stuff inside and looking around and just kind of making themselves at home. The foghorn sounds repeatedly in the background, and it is an awful synthetic sound. Robert Pattinson wanders around the living quarters, he lights a cigarette, and then he goes upstairs, hitting his head on the ceiling, and that reinforces that this is a tiny bedroom. There are 2 little kid beds like Bert and Ernie, and he finds his bunkmate, Willem Dafoe, urinating into a pot between the beds and farting in the confined space. And it all conveys a sense of being isolated and far from civilization. Lots of boredom mixed with being trapped with another dude's bodily sounds. The first dialogue appears at 7 minutes, 11 seconds, and the two men sit at a cramped table for a meal. In my own totally subjective opinion, they are sitting way too close, facing right at each other in each other's personal space. And without any context, Willem Dafoe recites a poem. Now, up until that point, I had seriously wondered if this might be a film made entirely without dialogue, and I was ready to enjoy that. Anyway, after all of this, therefore, because of all of this, I am now ready to answer the most important question of all time. Is Robert Pattinson's mustache the most masculine thing you've ever seen? Well, I had previously watched Robert Eggers' other films, The Witch and The Northman, but I didn't expect to enjoy this film as much as I did those. So I gave it 5 out of 5 stars and a little heart on Letterboxd. Okay, that's the end of this episode of the Carl King Podcast. Remember to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to these dang podcasts. And if you like this show, support the creation of more episodes by joining my Patreon for $1 or $5 a month. That's patreon.com/Carl King. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. And as always, special thank you to my $51 a month patrons at the special illusionist level, Chubode and Hank Howard III. And thank you to all of the very good friends of Carl King for listening. And as I always say, dang ye, let Neptune strike ye dead, Winslow.